And there are some funny stories. I was just sharing with someone backstage, you know, so I witnessed this as I write about in the book, you know, from my stroller's eye view. And there's a funny family story about how, so my mother's marching with the extended family. I talk about like Aunt Mary and Uncle Freddie in the book. And she would tell the story about how, so they're marching. And this is back when strollers didn't really have armrests and seatbelts. So they're marching away and, you know, shouting and all of that. And then I think it was my Uncle Freddie, you know, looked down and looked in the stroller, which was empty, and said, "Where's Kamala?" And apparently they left me like a block behind. I'd fallen out the stroller. There you go. And then my mother would tell a funny story about how, like, one day and I was fussing, and you know, and so I'm fussing and fussing. It's much cuter when she would tell the story, but she'd say, so then she would look down at me and, "Kamala, what do you want? What do you want?" And I looked back up at her and I said, "Freedom."
I'm so glad you told that story on your own, because I was going to ask you, because I wanted to hear you say freedom.
Oh, yeah.
I wanted to talk about your father, economics professor, Stanford. They meet at Berkeley. They have you and Maya, and you loved going to the park.
Yes.
And your mom would, correct me if I'm wrong, would put limits on you in terms of like how far you could go, whatever. And your dad would say to you, "Run, run, Kamala, run."
That's right. He would say, "Do not be afraid. Let her go. Let her go. Let her run. You run as fast as you can. You run as far as you want." And I believe that his whole purpose was to say, do not be afraid and be fearless and run and run. And do not be afraid of falling. Do not let anybody stop you. Yeah.
There's a question here from the audience that I want to get in, since we're talking about your parents, and particularly your mother. And since you didn't write your name down, if you hear the question, just go, "Ah!" But I do think that this is relevant. And the person asks, how has being half Indian American shaped your identity and political views?
Well, I was born who I am, and I would say that the Indian influence on my life is really, a lot of it is based on what I described in terms of the experiences that I had in India. And you know, the family that I come from was very active, and I know that about, you know, India is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, democracy in the world. And so the idea of debating and discussing what it means to be a democracy. You know, my grandfather, I was the eldest grandchild. He convinced me I was his favorite, but I now know he convinced each one of us that we were his favorite. But being the eldest, my grandfather, by the time I was in my, like, 6, 7, 8 years old, he had retired. And we would go visit with them, and my grandfather had a routine every morning of taking a walk with his friends, his buddies, who were all also retired, all these old men, who would take their walk in the morning and discuss the glory days and then talk about politics. And it was a great honor, and people in the family would talk about that he wouldn't let anybody go on that walk with him, but he'd let me go on the walk with him. And I'd hold his hand as he'd walk with his buddies, talking about the need for an honest government, the need to wipe out corruption, a representative government. And I realized later how much I absorbed it, and it influenced me. And so that was a lot of the influence, in addition to just it being a culture, as I have experienced it, that is a very welcoming culture. It is a culture that is without judgment, and is really, I think, it's about really understanding the things that one must aspire to be. You know, one of the highest callings that you can have is to be a studied and learned person.